was raining hard that night, the kind of rain that makes the road disappear. I was driving home slow, thinking about nothing more than getting some rest, and the world suddenly went black. When I woke up in the ER, wires on my chest and a machine breathing beside me, the nurse asked one simple question. "Sir, who should we call?" I gave my daughter's name. Hours passed, then more hours. When she finally arrived, she didn't run to my bed. She stood at the door and whispered to the doctor, "Is he still conscious?" Rain had a way of making the house feel smaller. That night, the sound pressed against the windows like fingers tapping for entry, steady and patient. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked louder than usual, or maybe hearing had grown more sensitive with age. Supper was simple: toast, a bowl of soup. Nothing fancy. Living alone teaches restraint. You cook only what you need, speak only when necessary, and learn to sit comfortably with your own thoughts. The house had been quiet since my wife passed. Not the painful kind of quiet anymore, just a settled one. Mornings came slower these days. Joints complained before the mind caught up. Still, independence mattered. It always had. I paid my bills, kept my car running, and stayed out of anyone's way. Family checked in when they remembered. That was enough. Or so it had become easier to believe. That evening required a short drive across town. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Just another errand that couldn't wait until morning. The rain picked up as soon as the engine turned over. Thick drops smearing the windshield into streaks of light and shadow. The radio murmured softly, an old soul song half lost beneath the storm. Roads glistened like black glass. Driving at night wasn't what it used to be. Eyes took longer to adjust, hands tired quicker, and the body no longer bounced back from small mistakes. Traffic thinned as the town settled in for the night. Thoughts drifted the way they often did behind the wheel. Memories of years when rain meant laughter and crowded back seats, when silence came only after everyone was safely home. Those years felt distant, like postcards from another life. A sharp turn appeared too quickly. Tires slipped, the world lurched sideways. There was no time to react, just the violent sound of metal folding in on itself, the jolt of something unforgiving striking back. Air left the lungs in a rush. Pain arrived confused, scattered everywhere at once. The radio cut off. Rain continued, indifferent. For a moment, everything went very still, broken only by a distant ringing that seemed to come from inside my own head. Voices followed, lights, hands that didn't belong to me pulling doors open, asking questions that took effort to answer. Words came slowly, as if wading through thick water. The ride to the hospital blurred together. Sirens, ceiling lights passing overhead, the steady insistence of someone telling me to stay awake. The emergency room smelled of disinfectant and urgency. Bright lights erased any sense of time. Nurses moved with practiced speed, speaking in clipped tones. Papers were pushed closer, questions repeated. Age was noted before anything else. I caught fragments of conversation drifting just out of reach, decisions being made somewhere nearby. Someone mentioned contacting family. Time stretched in that waiting space between awareness and exhaustion. Machines hummed softly. Every few minutes, someone checked a chart, adjusted a line, asked how the pain felt. Each time, reassurance came easily. People had lives. Traffic was bad. Nights like this happened without warning. Hours passed. Then footsteps slowed near the bed. My daughter stood there, coat damp, expression unreadable. She was polite, careful, already tired. Apologies were offered, light and quick, as if late arrivals were expected. Concern hovered, but something else lingered beneath it. Distance, calculation, a subtle shift impossible to ignore. Lying there, listening to machines breathe in measured rhythm, a quiet realization settled in. The accident was over, but something else had begun to fracture. Survival, it seemed, no longer guaranteed belonging. The ceiling above the ICU bed had hairline cracks shaped like rivers on an old map. I followed them with my eyes while machines worked quietly beside me, each beep steady, indifferent. Pain settled in waves, never sharp enough to scream, never dull enough to forget. Breathing took effort. Movement was a suggestion, not an option. Voices came and went, softened by curtains and distance. Silence in that room wasn't empty. It was crowded with pauses. I sensed it before anything was said, the way footsteps slowed, the way words were measured before leaving someone's mouth. I had spent a lifetime listening more than speaking. That habit sharpened with age. When you listen long enough, tension announces itself. A doctor stopped near the bed, flipping through a chart. He spoke calmly, professionally, as if reading from a script he'd memorized years ago. Questions followed. Next of kin, consent, decision-making authority. Nothing unusual, nothing cruel. Still, answers didn't come easily. My daughter stood a few feet away. She nodded when required, hesitated when clarity mattered. Eyes avoided mine, fixed instead on the floor, the door, anywhere but my face. It struck me then how quickly a person could become a subject rather than a presence. They spoke about me, not to me, as if age had quietly erased my voice. The doctor pressed gently. Clarification was needed. Authority had to be established. That was when it happened. Not shouted, not whispered, just stated. "He's not my real father." The words landed without ceremony, as factual as a date or a diagnosis. No malice coloured her tone. No apology followed. It sounded rehearsed, practiced enough to feel ready. The room didn't react. Pens continued moving. The chart absorbed the sentence like it belonged there. Something inside tightened, not with rage, but with focus. I didn't interrupt, didn't turn my head. Years of restraint held firm. That sentence replayed itself, not to wound, but to be examined. I searched it for meaning, for motive. Real. Father. The order mattered. The distance was intentional. Pain flared briefly, then receded. Breath slowed. Memory stepped forward. School mornings, late shifts, quiet sacrifices no one recorded. The body responded before emotion could rise. grounding me where I lay. There would be time to feel later. Understanding came first. Minutes passed, maybe more. She shifted, checked her phone, spoke softly to a nurse about obligations waiting elsewhere. When she left, it was without urgency or reassurance. A gentle exit, the kind reserved for errands, not emergencies. Curtains closed again. Staff resumed their routine. I remained. Lying there alone, it became clear there was no advocate standing between me and the paperwork. No one to question decisions, to insist on explanations. Absence took shape, solid and deliberate. That sentence hadn't been spoken carelessly. It had cleared a path. Cold clarity settled in. Anger would have been easier, denial more comfortable. Instead, a line appeared, clean, unmistakable. I wouldn't beg for space in a life I had already earned. If identity could be dismissed so simply, then understanding its foundations mattered more than pleading for recognition. A nurse adjusted something at my side, eyes kind but hurried. Forms were updated, names mattered, relationships mattered. The thought surfaced quietly, fully formed. Erasure didn't require shouting. Sometimes it happened with a pen. If she could erase me with a sentence, I needed to know how long she'd been practicing. Morning crept in without ceremony. No sunrise, no birdsong, just the gradual thinning of darkness as fluorescent lights dimmed and shifted. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by monitors and the quiet shuffle of staff. When consciousness settled fully, the body felt heavier than it had the night before. Not weaker, exactly. More aware of limits. The sentence from earlier lingered, but only as an echo. It no longer repeated itself word for word. Instead, it left a shape behind, like an outline drawn in pencil. Something to be studied, not stared at. Shock had done its work. What remained was awareness. The ICU followed a rhythm that didn't care who lay in the bed. Nurses rotated with practiced efficiency, offering polite greetings and routine questions. Names were checked against wristbands. Charts were scanned, updated, moved along. Each interaction was calm, professional, distant in a way that felt intentional. No one mentioned family. No phone calls were made on my behalf. The room belonged to systems now, not relationships. At some point, a nurse paused longer than the others. She reviewed the screen beside the bed, brows knitting slightly. Fingers tapped, scrolled, then stopped. Her voice stayed gentle when she spoke, but something underneath it shifted. "We don't have a confirmed emergency contact listed," she said, almost apologetically. "We'll need to update that." The words settled quietly. No accusation, no surprise. Just a statement pulled straight from a record. There it was. Not as a feeling, not as a conversation, but as fact. The absence had been documented. Whatever explanation existed had already been accepted somewhere beyond this room. Paperwork followed. Forms appeared. Screens refreshed. While one question was answered, another changed. On a display briefly angled my way, a category stood out before the nurse adjusted it again. Relationship status. Classification. The label was simple. Other. That word carried weight far beyond its size. It wasn't personal. That was the problem. It reduced years into a checkbox, history into an inconvenience. In that moment, the story shifted. This wasn't about affection or resentment. It was about identity. and how easily it could be reassigned when no one objected. Lying there, it became clear how silence had shaped this outcome. Independence had always been worn like armor, not asking for help, not demanding space. Over time, people learned to step back. Absence, when consistent enough, begins to look like permission. There was no resolve forming yet, no plan, just attention sharpening. If names could be altered this easily, then someone had prepared the ground long before the accident. Systems don't improvise, they follow trails. The thought arrived fully formed, steady and calm. Erasure starts on paper. Everything else follows. If my name could disappear this easily, I needed to know who helped make it happen. The thought stayed with me through the late morning, steady and uninvited. This did not begin with the accident. It settled in like a fact I'd been avoiding, not because it frightened me, but because it required something unfamiliar. Action. For years, silence had been my answer to discomfort. It kept things calm. It kept people comfortable. Lying there now, watching the light shift across the wall, it felt less like wisdom and more like training. I had been trained to absorb, not to ask. That morning, for the first time in a long while, a question took shape and refused to leave. A woman from hospital services stopped by just before noon. She spoke softly, the way people do when they believe softness equals kindness. She mentioned planning ahead, making sure everything was in order. Her eyes flicked briefly to the clipboard, then back to me. "It might be a good idea to review your documents," she said, "just to be safe." The phrase sounded harmless enough, sensible even, but it carried an implication that pressed against the ribs. Authority, I realized, was no longer assumed. It needed confirmation. The system wasn't waiting for me to recover. It was adjusting to my absence. When families step away, paperwork fills the space quickly. After she left, the room felt smaller. Not tighter, just more defined. Lines were being drawn quietly, and I was only now being shown where they ran. I waited until my hands stopped shaking before reaching for the phone. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was careful, almost clinical. One question, neutral, no history, no emotion attached, just clarification. When my daughter answered, her voice was polite, warm enough to pass inspection. I asked about the paperwork, about why certain things had changed. There was a pause on the line, brief but telling. She suggested I might be confused, said the medication could make things seem worse than they were. She told me to rest, to let others handle the details. Every word was wrapped in concern, but the message underneath was firm. Stop asking. Listening to her, something settled into place. Being talked over felt worse than being argued with. Anger could be met. This was erasure with a smile. Concern used as a barrier. Care turned into control. When the call ended, there was no resolution, only understanding. I hadn't been answered. I'd been warned. The room returned to its quiet rhythm, machines humming, footsteps passing outside the door. Politeness, I realized, hides intention better than anger ever could. If questions were already unwelcome, then answers were being guarded. Someone had been planning for a world without me, and if that were true, I needed to know what they expected to gain from it. The phone call stayed with me longer than the pain in my ribs. Not the words, we hadn't said much worth quoting, but the tone. That careful calm. The way concern had been wrapped around dismissal so neatly it almost sounded kind. Lying there as the afternoon light shifted across the hospital wall, it became clear that the call hadn't been meant to clarify anything. It had been meant to end questions. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with weight. A settling feeling, like realizing a door had closed quietly behind me, and no one planned to mention it. By late afternoon, the hospital had fallen into a different rhythm. Fewer voices, longer pauses. Nurses moved with practiced ease, their steps soft against the linoleum. One of them stopped by my room with a tablet in hand, friendly enough, professional in every way that matters. She explained, almost apologetically, that certain information now required authorization. On file. Test results, discharge planning, medication changes. Her words were careful, rehearsed, policy, procedure, nothing personal. I asked just as carefully whose authorization was on file. She hesitated, not long enough to be rude, long enough to tell the truth without saying it out loud. In that moment, the room felt smaller, not because of walls or machines, but because access to my own life had narrowed without my consent. No one raised their voice, no one threatened me. Everything was clean, polite, and locked behind rules that suddenly didn't bend in my direction. What unsettled me wasn't the restriction itself, it was how smoothly it had happened, as if the groundwork had already been laid. Paperwork didn't scramble overnight. Decisions didn't float in from nowhere. Systems moved only when someone pushed them. Alone again, I stared at the ceiling and began to connect what I'd been careful not to connect before. The delayed arrival, the words spoken in clinical tones, the absence of my name where it should have been. The phone call meant to quiet me. None of it screamed urgency. All of it suggested preparation. Later, as the hallway grew quieter, another staff member stopped by. Casual conversation, routine update. Then, almost as an aside, she mentioned that someone had attempted to make a decision earlier that day, on my behalf. The way she said it mattered. No drama, no warning. Just information passed along as if it were already settled. That was the moment the line moved. Until then, exclusion had felt passive. Now it was active. Someone hadn't just stepped away, they had stepped in, and not to help. I didn't argue. I didn't demand explanations. I could feel the story forming around me already. Elderly patient, confused, overwhelmed. Any sudden resistance would slide neatly into that version. Silence, I realized, could still be dangerous, but it could also be deliberate. So I chose stillness. When the nurse asked if there was anything I needed, I said yes. Copies of forms, names of departments, times things had been logged. Simple requests, reasonable ones, the kind that didn't sound like panic or protest. She nodded and wrote them down. As evening crept closer, the room dimmed, and with it came a clarity that didn't hurt as much as it should have. Something was being done without me, not out of chaos or misunderstanding, but design. And waiting, the way I always had, would only make it easier. Family wasn't the center of this anymore. Proof was. If they were already making decisions for me, then it was time I learned exactly what they were planning to take. Morning light crept in through the narrow hospital window, thin and colorless, the kind that didn't promise anything new. Sleep had come in fragments, not pain exactly, more the sense that something essential had shifted while I lay still. When I opened my eyes, there was no confusion left, only caution. The room felt quieter than it should have, as if even the machines were waiting. No calls overnight, no updates passed through anyone but staff. That absence said more than reassurance ever could. Whatever was happening, it wasn't drifting anymore. It was moving. A clerk arrived mid-morning with the records I'd asked for the night before. She spoke softly, as if volume alone could bruise someone my age. The folder was thicker than I expected. I turned pages slowly, reading the way I always had, carefully, line by line. One form stopped me. Consent for a procedure that hadn't happened yet. The space where my name should have been signed sat empty. Not crossed out, not questioned, just blank. The clerk didn't notice my pause. Or maybe she did and chose not to. The absence wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. I understood then how quiet theft works. No raised voices, no force, just decisions sliding past while you're encouraged to rest. I'd seen it before, long before this hospital bed. Moments when choices were handled, when explanations arrived after the fact. At the time, I'd mistaken that for care. Looking at that unsigned line, the pattern sharpened. Control doesn't arrive with a warning. It arrives wrapped in efficiency. Another page followed. Emergency contact. Representative. A name appeared where mine should have been. Someone else listed as the point of authority. Typed cleanly. Professionally. No announcement had been made to me. No conversation offered. Replacement doesn't require permission when people assume you won't object. The realization landed heavy but clean. This wasn't confusion. It was design. The urge to call someone, to demand answers, rose fast and hot, and passed. Confrontation would only scatter what I needed intact. So I stayed still. I read again. Dates. Times, initials. I began to remember the way patience can be used as a tool, not a weakness. Every detail mattered now. Every small mark told a story someone hoped I wouldn't read. Later, a different voice entered the room. An administrator, neutral, careful. She didn't take sides. She only mentioned that certain discrepancies could be reviewed if I wished. The phrasing mattered. It meant not everyone saw me as incapable. It meant the narrative wasn't settled yet. By the time she left, the direction was clear. Trust inside my family had thinned to nothing useful. What remained was paper, timing, and attention. Whoever believed I wouldn't notice had misjudged the quiet. I had spent a lifetime reading between lines. Something shifted that afternoon, and no one announced it. It showed up in smaller ways, how long it took for a nurse to return, how carefully a question was phrased, how often someone double-checked a screen before speaking. The room felt the same, but the air around me didn't. It was tighter, more deliberate. I'd spent enough years in workplaces and churches and family rooms to know that feeling. It meant people were paying attention in a new way. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't threatened anyone. All I'd done was ask for copies, names, dates, quiet things, paper things. But paper has weight, and once it starts moving, it makes noise others can hear, even when you think you're being discreet. Late in the afternoon, my phone buzzed on the tray beside the bed. Her name lit up the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Not to play games, just to listen to what my body was telling me. There was no fear, no rush, just alertness. Her voice was warmer than it had been in days, softer too. She asked how I was feeling, said she'd been worried. The words themselves weren't wrong. It was the order they came in, the pauses between them that gave things away. This wasn't a call driven by concern. It was a temperature check. I kept my answers simple. I was resting. Doctors were monitoring things, nothing dramatic. I didn't mention forms or names or what I'd seen. I spoke the way I always had, steady, polite, and remarkable. On the other end, I could almost hear her recalculating. Warmth stayed in her voice, but it tightened, like someone smiling through a test. When the call ended, the room felt quieter than before, not peaceful, intentional. Visiting hours came and went. No footsteps I recognized, no familiar faces at the door. The hallway lights dimmed as evening settled in, and with it came a different kind of silence. This one wasn't accidental. Phones went unanswered, messages stayed unread. Even the nurses seemed less forthcoming, careful not to offer more than what was asked for directly. That was when it became clear. Isolation wasn't a side effect. It was the plan. Lying there, listening to the steady rhythm of machines, I thought about how often in my life I'd been the easy one, the one who didn't push, the one who didn't demand explanations. It had always seemed like strength, to keep things calm, to let others take the lead. But ease can be mistaken for absence, and silence for permission. I decided then that I wouldn't fill the quiet anymore. If they wanted space, they'd have it, from me as well. When a nurse asked if I wanted to update family, I said I'd handle that later. When someone mentioned coordinating with relatives, I asked for everything in writing. No tone, no edge, just clarity. Funny thing about silence when it's chosen, it stops being a weakness. It turns into a boundary. By nightfall, I could feel the pressure building on the other side of that boundary. Delays grew longer. Smiles became fixed. The warmth from earlier didn't return. That was fine. I wasn't looking for comfort anymore. I was looking for truth. And truth doesn't rush to meet you. It waits to see if you're serious. Staring at the ceiling, I understood something that would have scared me a week ago. I wasn't invisible anymore. And when people realize you're watching back, they don't stay neutral for long. The nurse didn't say much when she told me there would be a family meeting. She used that careful tone people use when they think words might break something fragile. It wasn't an invitation. It was a notice. The kind that assumes you'll show up because not showing up would look worse. I nodded, slow and steady, like a man agreeing to a blood pressure check. Inside there was no fear, just a familiar tightening, the kind that comes when you recognize a pattern you've seen before, but hoped you'd never see again. They wheeled me down the hall later that evening. The lights felt harsher than usual. The hospital quiet had shifted from clinical to expectant. I remember thinking how strange it was that a place built to heal could feel like a courthouse after hours. The conference room door was already open. Voices dropped when I crossed the threshold. Everyone was there already. Chairs were pulled close together on one side of the table. I was guided to a single seat facing them. No one stood. No one said my name. A few smiles appeared, practiced and brief, like they'd been rehearsed in the hallway. I took in details the way I always do when words don't match the room. My daughter sat with her hands folded, posture stiff, eyes bright but guarded. Someone else avoided looking at me altogether. Papers were stacked neatly in front of them, aligned with care that suggested preparation. They thought I'd be disoriented. That much was clear. The meeting started without ceremony. A social worker spoke first, voice calm, professional, outlining next steps and planning ahead. Phrases floated across the table like decisions already made. No one asked what I wanted. They spoke about me, not to me, as if proximity was a substitute for permission. It didn't take long for the language to shift. What's best going forward? Reducing stress, making sure things are handled. Handled by whom was never said out loud. I felt the shape of the trap then. The goal wasn't agreement, it was fatigue. If they talked long enough, carefully enough, I would nod. I had done it before, for decades. Let things slide to keep the peace. Let silence do the heavy lifting. So I stayed quiet. At first, they didn't notice. Words kept coming, filling the space they expected me to occupy with confusion or gratitude. When the silence stretched, someone cleared their throat. Another leaned forward, explaining the same point again with different words. The longer I said nothing, the more uncomfortable the room became. People reveal themselves when they rush to fill quiet. That was when one of them mentioned the plan, casually, as if it were common knowledge. A reference to paperwork already drafted, steps already outlined, a future arranged neatly on paper. They assumed I hadn't seen it. I lifted my eyes then, slowly, and spoke for the first time. Not loud, not sharp, just enough to be heard. The document you're talking about lists a contact change dated yesterday morning, I said. It also references a consent section that doesn't carry my signature. The room froze. Faces shifted. Someone blinked too fast. My daughter's hands tightened together. No one corrected me. I continued, still calm. There's also a clause about decision authority if I'm deemed unable to respond. That part stood out. Shock moved through the room like a draft. They hadn't expected clarity, certainly not specifics. Questions replaced statements. Explanations followed explanations. Concern rose in volume, thinly veiled now, less confident. The balance had tipped, and everyone felt it. I didn't accuse anyone, didn't raise my voice. There was no need. Awareness did the work for me. The meeting ended shortly after. No conclusions, no agreements. Just a quiet scramble to regain footing as they filed out, avoiding my eyes again. One truth settled in with a weight that surprised me by its calm. Whatever they had planned, they hadn't planned on me paying attention. That night, as the room emptied and the hallway sounds returned to their usual rhythm, I understood something else too. When a plan is exposed too early, the people behind it don't stop. They panic. The door closed behind us with a sound that lingered longer than it should have. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. I stayed where I was for a moment, seated, hands resting on my knees, listening to the quiet return to the hallway. When I finally stood, I noticed something small but telling. No one waited for anyone else. They drifted apart in different directions, shoes scraping lightly against the floor, conversations stopping mid-breath. Whatever unity they had brought into that room didn't survive the walk back out. In the hallway, politeness felt stretched thin. A nod here, a quick "take care" there. Voices softer than before, like everyone was suddenly aware of being overheard. I passed my daughter without stopping. She looked at me as if she wanted to say something, then thought better of it. Her phone buzzed. She turned away. That was new. For the first time, she didn't look in control, just busy pretending she was. By the time I reached my room, the air had shifted. Nurses spoke more carefully. Questions were asked twice, sometimes 3 times. The clipboard paused longer at the foot of my bed before moving on. No one explained anything outright, but explanations weren't needed. Systems change their behavior when something doesn't add up. I'd seen it before in other places, other years. This was no different. Later that afternoon, voices carried from the hallway outside my door. Not loud enough to be intentional, not quiet enough to be private. I caught fragments, a disagreement about timing, someone insisting they were only trying to help, another voice pushing back, sharper, saying that certain things should have been disclosed sooner. I didn't need names to recognize the strain. Alliances crack the moment accountability enters the room. Everyone wants to be the one who didn't know enough to be blamed. I stayed still and let the sounds pass. No satisfaction came with it, only confirmation. When people start explaining themselves without being asked, it means fear has replaced confidence. That kind of fear doesn't disappear on its own. It looks for somewhere else to land. By evening, I was cleared to leave. The parking lot smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. My car waited where I'd left it days earlier, a thin layer of dust on the hood, like proof that time keeps moving even when you don't. As I drove home through familiar streets, the town looked unchanged. Same storefronts, same stoplights. But it felt different now. Smaller, maybe, or quieter. Truth has a way of shrinking things that once felt overwhelming. At home, the house greeted me with its usual stillness. No lights left on, no voices in the other room. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floor beneath my shoes. I sat at the kitchen table and didn't turn on the television. Silence felt earned. Outside, a neighbour's dog barked once, then settled. Life going on, uninterrupted. The next morning brought phone calls I hadn't expected. Short ones, careful ones. A hospital administrator wanting to clarify a timeline. Someone from an office downtown asking about documentation. Questions framed as routine, but carrying weight. I answered calmly, sticking to facts, dates, names. What I had seen, what I had not signed. Each answer landed somewhere beyond me now, moving through channels I didn't control. By afternoon, the tone of incoming messages shifted again. One family member called and spoke too quickly, assuring me they'd always meant well. Another didn't call at all. Silence can be louder than apology when it arrives at the wrong time. I listened, said little, and ended the conversations when they circled back on themselves. There was no point chasing explanations. that came only after consequences showed up. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun lowered itself behind the trees. I thought about legacy, not money or property, but presence. About how easy it is to mistake quiet endurance for permission. Some bridges don't burn. They're dismantled piece by piece, politely, until there's nothing left to cross. There was grief in that realization, but not regret. Not anymore. Certain doors close whether you knock or not. What mattered now was standing where I could see clearly, without needing anyone else to vouch for my place in the room. I understood then that the next phase wouldn't involve raised voices or emotional plea. It would move through offices, files, and questions asked by people with no history invested in protecting anyone's version of events. Once truth leaves the family room and enters the real world, it doesn't ask for permission. The call came in the middle of the morning, just as the house was settling into its quiet rhythm, the kind of quiet you notice only after chaos has passed. I was standing by the window, watching a delivery truck struggle to turn around at the end of the street when the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I answered without hesitation. The voice on the other end was calm, practiced, a lawyer, referred by someone whose name I recognized from the hospital paperwork. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't mention family. He spoke in terms of process, documentation, next steps. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Whatever this had been, it no longer belonged to living rooms or whispered conversations. It had crossed into a space where words were recorded and dates mattered. We met 2 days later in a small office downtown. Nothing fancy. Neutral walls, a table wide enough that no one felt crowded. Files already laid out when I arrived. The lawyer slid a folder toward me and waited. Inside were copies of forms I had only glimpsed before, signatures where mine should have been, dates that didn't line up, authorizations marked complete without my consent. It wasn't one mistake, it was a pattern. Seeing it all together didn't hurt the way I thought it might. There was no rush of anger, no tightness in my chest, just clarity. This was why the tone had shifted, why voices had softened, why concern had suddenly appeared where distance once lived. Paper doesn't forget. For the first time in days, wasn't being talked over or redirected. Questions were answered directly. When I spoke, notes were taken. I wasn't a problem to manage. I was a person whose rights had been bypassed. Later that afternoon, we stepped outside the courthouse. The building stood solid and indifferent, like it had for decades. I sat in my car with the engine off, letting the weight of it all settle. A formal notice had been issued. Accounts temporarily frozen, pending review. An investigation opened, not loudly, not publicly, but officially. The first real consequence. Quiet, procedural, and impossible to undo with a phone call or apology. There was no satisfaction in it, only a deep, steady breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Accountability doesn't feel like victory when it arrives this way. It feels like balance being restored after a long tilt. Driving home, I took the long route, past streets I used to walk with my wife, past places where memories lived without asking permission. I thought about what had been lost, alongside what had been protected. Some relationships don't survive truth. Some never deserved to. Both can be true at the same time. That evening, I spread the documents out on my kitchen table, organized them, labeled them. Not because I was afraid, but because I was done being careless with my own life. Boundaries don't announce themselves. You build them quietly and keep them standing. I knew then that explanations weren't owed anymore, to anyone. Justice doesn't repair everything, but it protects the truth. And once the truth is written into record, the only question left is what kind of man you choose to be afterward. The house felt different once the noise was gone. Not quieter, just heavier. Morning light slid across the living room floor and stopped at the empty chair by the window. The one no one ever chose unless they planned to stay a while. Dust moved slowly in the air. The clock kept time like it always had, but the rhythm felt exposed now that there was nothing left to interrupt it. Conflict leaves in a hurry. Absence takes its time. I moved through the rooms without turning on lights, touching the back of the couch, the edge of the kitchen counter, the door frame where height had been marked years ago. Nothing had changed, and that was the problem. When trouble ends, it doesn't take its fingerprints with it. It leaves them on ordinary things and waits for you to notice. The phone rang just after noon. I let it ring twice longer than necessary. The name on the screen wasn't a surprise. Voices sound different when they don't have leverage. Softer, careful. The words came out arranged, like they'd been practiced in front of a mirror. An apology shaped by explanation, padded with reasons. Not cruel, not honest either. I listened without interrupting. Listening has always been a skill I learned early and used late. When the words ran out, there was a pause, as if silence itself might convince me. I thanked them for calling. I said I hoped they were well. I didn't say everything was forgiven, because that wouldn't have been true. I didn't say never again, because that wouldn't have been necessary. Timing matters. Some repairs fail because the damage waited too long to be acknowledged. Forgiveness gets confused with forgetting. I've learned they are not the same. Forgetting asks you to betray your own memory. Forgiveness asks you to release what's no longer useful to carry. One erases the past. The other sets a boundary around it. I chose the boundary. It felt firm, not sharp, like a fence built to keep the peace inside, not to punish what stays out. Distance isn't hatred. It's clarity with room to breathe. I made that choice without speeches or conditions. No lists of grievances. No requests for proof. Just a simple understanding of where I stand and where I won't stand again. Love doesn't require proximity, and dignity doesn't negotiate. Later, I sat on the front porch and watched a neighbour load groceries from a trunk. We nodded the way people do when they've shared the same street long enough to recognise effort. He asked how I was doing. I said I was getting there. He said that counted. It did. Sometimes support arrives without history or expectations, and that's exactly why it holds. In the quiet, thoughts turned toward legacy. Not what gets inherited, but what gets modelled. Aging has a way of clarifying what matters when applause fades. I thought about peace as something practiced daily, not awarded at the end. Pain doesn't disappear because you understand it, but it loosens its grip when you stop letting it decide your next step. As evening settled, the house felt smaller again, manageable, not empty, honest. I made a cup of tea and sat where the light had been earlier. watching it leave the room the way it always does. Some stories don't end with reunions. Some end with self-respect, and that's enough to carry forward. The weeks that followed were quieter than anyone expected. No angry messages, no sudden appearances, no speeches demanding explanations. That calm unsettled people more than shouting ever could. When someone waits for retaliation and it never arrives, they begin to imagine it anyway. Peace, I learned, is often mistaken for weakness by those who've never had to earn it. Life settled into a steady rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch, short walks when the weather allowed, familiar faces at the grocery store. I could feel eyes on me sometimes, curiosity mixed with unease. They expected bitterness. They expected drama. Instead, there was distance, composure, and a silence that didn't ask for permission. The truth is, the most important decision had already been made, quietly, legally, and well before anyone realized I was paying attention. Paperwork signed with a clear hand, arrangements reviewed, updated, sealed, not in anger, not in revenge, in clarity. Years of planning adjusted to reflect reality, not promises that no longer held weight. No confrontation was required. Facts don't argue, they simply take effect. When the change became visible, it didn't arrive with announcements. It showed up in meetings, records, and polite confirmations from people who had nothing to gain from family loyalties. That was when the silence broke, on their side. Confusion, disbelief, regret that came too late to change anything meaningful. I didn't explain myself. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require witnesses to be loud. Watching it unfold felt strange, not satisfying in the way movies pretend revenge should be. More grounded than that, like standing on solid ground after years of adjusting your balance on shifting floors. I noticed how quickly certainty faded when control did, how quiet people became when they realized the story they'd planned no longer belonged to them. There were many things I chose not to do. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't humiliate or destroy reputations. I didn't rehearse speeches from moments that never came. Anger burns fast and leaves nothing useful behind. Dignity takes longer, but it stays. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in keeping my life intact. What mattered most was the lesson carved into the quiet. Boundaries are not punishments. They are protections. Aging doesn't mean surrendering authority. It means learning where to place it so it lasts. Love can exist alongside accountability, and peace does not require permission from those who benefit from your silence. If there's anything worth passing on, it's this. Plan while you are clear, not while you are hurt. Protect yourself without becoming hardened, and understand that walking away whole is not weakness. It's wisdom practiced late, but not too late. Some relationships remained broken. I accepted that without bitterness. Closure doesn't always arrive as reconciliation. Sometimes it arrives as a decision to stop waiting for one. The rest of my life is mine to shape now, quietly, deliberately, and without apology. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the porch once more, steady and unremarkable in the best way. No audience, no verdict to wait for. Just a man who knew his worth without needing anyone else to confirm it. They thought revenge would look like anger, but the real shock was this. I walked away whole, and they had to live with the truth. At this age, I've learned something important. Family isn't proven by blood, but by who shows up when you're at your weakest. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg for love. I simply chose dignity over anger. And that choice changed everything. If this story made you stop and think about your own family, your own boundaries, or your own worth, then it was worth telling. No matter how old you are, it's never too late to protect yourself, to speak up in your own quiet way, and to live the rest of your life with peace. Thank you for listening until the end. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight?